I thought a text message banning me from a family party was the worst thing that could happen on a Friday afternoon. I was entirely wrong. It was the absolute best thing to ever happen to me. My mother sent me a message telling me I was forbidden from attending my own sister's engagement party. She said the guest list was finalized, and my presence would only humiliate our family in front of the wealthy in-laws. She told me to stay home and focus on my little computer hobbies. I did exactly what she asked. I went back to work. But what my mother did not know was that while she was busy trying to hide my existence from her elite social circle, the rest of the world was about to see my face everywhere. The next morning, my parents woke up to find me on the cover of Forbes magazine. By noon, my sister was leaving me frantic voicemails. Her voice was shaking with rage as she demanded to know how I could do this to our family. And by 1 o'clock, the father who had disowned me was screaming in my lobby, "Let me tell you exactly how I burned their perfect illusion to the ground." It was exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon when my phone lit up on my custom marble desk. I was sitting in my penthouse office on the 40th floor, looking out through the massive windows at the sprawling Maryland skyline. The text was from my mother, Vivian. I opened it fully expecting another list of demands or a reminder of my inadequacy. Instead, the message read, "Do not come to Brianna's engagement party tonight. The guest list is final. The Montgomery family comes from old wealth, and I will not have you showing up in your cheap thrift store suits, embarrassing us by talking about your little computer hobbies. Know your place." I read the message twice. A few years ago, those words would have shattered me. I would have spent the evening crying in my apartment wondering why I was never good enough for the woman who gave birth to me. I would have agonized over why my sister Brianna, the golden child and successful dermatologist, got the grand celebrations while I was treated like a dirty secret. We grew up in a prominent neighborhood in Prince George County, where image was everything. My parents spent their entire lives climbing the social ladder, desperate to be accepted by the wealthiest families in the area. Brianna was their masterpiece. She was beautiful and compliant, and she chose a respectable medical career that my parents could brag about at their exclusive country club dinners. I was the rebel who asked too many questions and challenged their shallow priorities. But sitting in my office today, I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel sorrow. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. My mother was so obsessed with curating the perfect image for high society that she had completely blinded herself to reality. I looked around my office. I admired the sleek minimalist design and the panoramic views and the sheer scale of the empire I had built from nothing. My cheap thrift store suits were actually custom-tailored pieces from Paris. My little computer hobbies had revolutionized global supply chains. I picked up my phone and typed a single thumbs-up emoji. I hit send and placed the phone face down on the cool marble surface. I was exactly where I belonged. The heavy glass door of my office swung open. My executive assistant walked in with her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. She held a sleek black frame in her hands, and her face was beaming with a pride that my own family had never shown me. "The advance copies just arrived, boss," she said, placing the frame carefully on the center of my desk. I leaned forward to look at it. It was the brand new issue of Forbes magazine. Staring back at me was my own face, looking sharp and composed and utterly untouchable. The headline, printed in bold gold letters, read, "The Silent Billionaire. How 29-year-old Nyla Built AuraSync into a $1.2 billion supply chain empire." I ran my fingers over the smooth glass of the frame. The contrast between my mother's text message and the reality sitting on my desk was almost poetic. She had just told me to focus on my little computer hobbies. She had mocked my clothes and my lifestyle, completely unaware that the daughter she considered a failure was currently commanding an industry. I remembered the day I walked away from medical school. I was 24 years old and utterly suffocated by the path my parents had forced upon me. When I told them I wanted to drop out to pursue technology and software development, the backlash was apocalyptic. My father, Reginald, called me a disgrace. My mother told me I was throwing away my life and embarrassing our lineage. They cut me off financially that very afternoon, confident that poverty would force me to crawl back and beg for their forgiveness. They severely underestimated my resilience. I worked double shifts at a diner to pay my rent while teaching myself advanced coding late into the night. I ate cheap noodles and wore worn-out shoes and refused to ask them for a single dime. Every line of code I wrote was fueled by the memory of their dismissal. And now, 5 years later, the result of those sleepless nights was framed on my desk and validated by the most prestigious business publication in the world. I thanked my assistant and told her to make sure a copy of the magazine was placed in every waiting room of our building. The engagement party happened that night. I spent the evening at home enjoying a quiet dinner and a glass of vintage wine entirely undisturbed. I did not spare a single thought for the lavish event taking place across town, where my family was undoubtedly bowing and scraping to impress Brianna's new wealthy in-laws. But Saturday morning brought the storm. The digital issue of Forbes dropped at 6 in the morning. By 8 o'clock, the news had saturated every social media platform and business blog and local news outlet. My phone, which had been silent the night before, began vibrating off the nightstand. I picked it up to see a barrage of notifications. 72 missed calls. Hundreds of text messages. I ignored all of them and went about my morning routine. When I sat down at my desk, I finally checked my voicemails. There were 5 from Brianna alone. I pressed play on the most recent one, turning the speakerphone on so her voice filled my spacious office. "What the hell did you do?" Brianna screamed, her voice shrill and trembling with absolute panic. "How did you pay for a fake magazine cover on the day of my engagement? Are you trying to ruin my life? My future in-laws are asking questions about you. Everyone is talking about this stupid article instead of my party. You are a jealous, spiteful liar, and you need to take this down right now before I call the police." I listened to her unhinged rant with a cool, detached amusement. Brianna had always been the center of attention as the flawless doctor engaged to the wealthy heir of a retail dynasty. She had structured her entire existence around being better than me. She could not comprehend a world where she was outshined, especially not by the sister she had bullied and belittled her entire life. Her assumption that I had somehow faked a Forbes cover just to spite her was a testament to her profound narcissism. She truly believed the universe revolved around her engagement party. I did not delete the voicemail. I saved it to a secure folder knowing it might be useful later. Then with a deep sense of satisfaction, I blocked her number. I had no intention of arguing with a woman throwing a temper tantrum over a magazine cover. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the quarterly projections for my European distribution centers. The quiet hum of the city below was a soothing soundtrack to my focus. I was finally feeling productive and relaxed. I was deep in a spreadsheet when the red light on my desk console flashed. The intercom buzzed, and my assistant's voice came through sounding unusually tense. "Mom, I am so sorry to interrupt your weekend work," she said quickly. "But there is a situation in the main lobby." I frowned, pressing the intercom button. "What kind of situation?" "There is a man downstairs causing a massive scene with the security team," she explained. "He is yelling at the front desk and demanding to be led up to the executive floor. He claims to be your biological father, Reginald." My grip on my pen tightened slightly. Reginald, the man who had looked at me 5 years ago and told me I would end up with nothing. The man who had watched my mother throw my belongings out the door and nodded in agreement. He had actually shown up at my building, the building he probably assumed belonged to someone else just a few hours ago. "And what exactly does he want?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. My assistant hesitated for a second before answering. "He is demanding that you come down and give him $50 million immediately. He says it is a family emergency and that you owe him for raising you." I leaned back in my leather chair as a slow and sharp smile spread across my face. $50 million. The sheer audacity of the demand was breathtaking. After a lifetime of emotional abuse, and after cutting me off without a second thought, and after my mother banned me from an engagement party just hours prior, my father was now standing in the lobby of the empire he mocked demanding a fortune. He genuinely believed that biological ties gave him the right to harvest the fruits of my labor. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking down at the street far below. I could not see him from up here, but I could perfectly picture his red and furious face yelling at my security guards. He was probably wearing one of his expensive suits trying to project authority in a place where he had absolutely none. This was the moment I had spent 5 grueling years preparing for. This was the payoff for every skipped meal, and every lonely holiday, and every moment of crushing doubt. I walked back to my desk and pressed the intercom button again. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of my power wash over me. The girl who had cried outside her parents' house with a single suitcase was completely gone. She had been replaced by a woman who could buy and sell the people who broke her. I adjusted the lapels of my suit and cleared my throat. "Tell security to stand down," I instructed my assistant, my voice ringing with absolute authority in the quiet room. "Do not let them touch him. Send him up to my office. Have someone escort him directly to the executive elevator so he does not cause any more damage to our ground floor fixtures. I want him to experience the full ride up. I want him to watch the floors tick by and realize just how high up I am now. Let us see exactly how desperate my father has become when faced with the daughter he tried to destroy. I'm going to teach him a lesson about business and family that he will never forget. And this time I am the one controlling the guest list. The war has officially begun, and I hold all the absolute power. I am waiting right here for him to step out of those elevator doors and face me." I released the intercom button and leaned back in my leather chair. My assistant had just told me that my father Reginald was in the lobby, screaming at security and demanding $50 million. I did not panic. I simply instructed her to send him up to the executive suite. I wanted him to take the private elevator. I wanted him to feel the smooth and silent ascent 40 floors above the city. I wanted him to have exactly 60 seconds to realize the sheer scale of the empire he was stepping into, the empire built by the daughter he had thrown away like trash. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open. Reginald strode in, but his usual arrogant swagger faltered for a fraction of a second. He was wearing his expensive tailored suit, the one he used to intimidate local politicians and contractors in Prince George County. But as he looked around my penthouse office, I saw the intimidation reflect back onto him. He took in the vaulted ceilings and the minimalist art and the panoramic views of the Maryland skyline. He was a man who had built his entire identity on being the most powerful person in the room. Now he was standing in a fortress that dwarfed his entire existence, and it belonged to me. He quickly masked his shock with a scowl, adjusting his tie as he marched toward my custom marble desk. He did not knock. He did not wait for an invitation to speak. He simply barged into my sanctuary carrying the exact same sense of entitlement he had weaponized against me my entire life. "You always had terrible taste, Nyla," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the massive space. "This office feels cold and sterile like a hospital waiting room. You could have hired a proper decorator instead of wasting money on this modern nonsense." I did not respond right away. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let his insult hang in the air, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocating. He paced across the hardwood floor, his leather shoes clicking sharply. He stopped right in front of my desk, looking down at me with the familiar disdain I had endured since childhood. He expected me to shrink under his gaze. He expected me to apologize for existing. He expected the scared medical school dropout he had banished 5 years ago. But I was the chief executive officer of Orasync, and I held his survival in my hands. "You have caused quite a mess for your mother," he continued, crossing his arms over his chest. "She is completely distraught over this ridiculous magazine cover. Brianna is in tears on the day of her engagement party because you decided to pull a cheap stunt for attention." I set my coffee mug down on a coaster. "The magazine cover is real." "Reginald," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "Just like this building is real and my bank accounts are real. I suggest you get to the point of your visit because my time is currently valued at several $1,000s a minute." His face reddened at my tone. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he snapped, leaning his hands on my desk. "I am your father. I put a roof over your head and food in your mouth. Your mother and I raised you in the best neighborhoods in Maryland. We gave you everything, and you owe this family." "I owe you nothing," I replied smoothly. "You cut me off 5 years ago when I refused to be a doctor. You told me I was dead to you. So tell me why the man who called me a disgrace is currently standing in my office demanding my attention." He stood up straight, trying to regain his dominant posture. His arrogance was a thin veil over his desperate reality. "Your mother and I raised you," he repeated, his voice tight with forced authority. "You owe us. I need $50 million. I need it transferred to my commercial real estate firm by Tuesday morning at the latest." My jaw almost dropped at the sheer audacity. He did not ask. He demanded. He actually believed he was entitled to the wealth I had built with my own blood and sweat. "And why exactly would I give you $50 million?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Because my business is facing a temporary cash flow issue," he lied smoothly. "The real estate market has been unpredictable, and I have several massive projects tied up in red tape. If I do not secure $50 million by Tuesday, the banks are going to cause unnecessary problems. But $50 million is pocket change for you now, according to your little article." He did not stop there. The greed in his eyes was palpable. "I also need an additional $2 million wired directly to your mother's account by tonight," he added casually, as if he were ordering a side dish at a restaurant. Brianna's wedding to Spencer Montgomery is going to be the social event of the decade. The Montgomery family comes from old white money, and we need to show them that our family operates on the exact same level. $2 million will cover the venue, the catering, and the floral arrangements. You will transfer the funds today." I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. "You want $52 million from the daughter you banished?" I summarized, my voice dripping with cold amusement. "And what exactly do I get in return for funding your failing business and my sister's lavish wedding to a man who does not even know I exist?" My father smiled, a cruel and condescending smile. He genuinely thought he held a winning hand. "If you transfer the money today, I will convince your mother to let you attend the rehearsal dinner next month," he offered generously. "I will make sure you get a seat at the back table. You can even come to the engagement party tonight if you stay out of the way. We will tell Richard Montgomery that you are doing well for yourself, so you do not embarrass Spencer in front of his wealthy relatives." I stared at him, taking in the absolute delusion of his proposal. He was offering me a back row seat at a party I did not even want to attend in exchange for $52 million. He thought my desperate childhood need for their approval was still intact. He thought I was still the broken girl seeking his validation. When I did not immediately reach for my checkbook, his smile faded, and the familiar anger returned. "Do not look at me like that," he growled, pacing away from the desk. "You owe us this, Nyla, after what you put us through. You always were a deceitful little girl. You have a moral obligation to fix this family after you nearly destroyed it." He turned to face me, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You act like you are so perfect sitting up here in your glass tower. But I remember exactly who you are. I remember when you stole from this family when you were 19 years old and dropped out of medical school. I should have let the police lock you up. I should have let them drag you away in handcuffs for what you did to your own blood." My heart beat slow and steady. He was bringing up the theft, the grand lie they had orchestrated 10 years ago to cover their own tracks. When I was 19, I had discovered the truth about my grandmother's trust fund, the money she had left explicitly for my education. I had found the ledger proving my parents forged my signature and drained every single penny to save his real estate firm the first time it faced bankruptcy. When I confronted them and threatened to go to the authorities, they turned the tables. They planted expensive family jewelry in my bedroom drawer and called the police. They told me that if I mentioned the trust fund, they would press charges for grand larceny. They used my youth and my fear to silence me. They branded me a thief to protect their precious social standing. And then they threw me out into the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. And now, 10 years later, he was standing in my office, trying to use that same fabricated crime to extort me. He thought the shame of that night still controlled me. He thought the fear of being exposed to the Montgomery family would force my hand. He thought I was terrified of Spencer and Richard Montgomery learning about my supposed criminal past. I picked up my coffee mug and took a long, deliberate sip. The dark roast was bitter and perfect. I let the silence stretch again, watching the sweat begin to form on his forehead. The power dynamic had completely shifted, but his ego refused to let him accept it. I set the mug down perfectly, aligning it with the edge of the coaster. "You are right, Reginald," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "I am deceitful. I am cold, and I am calculating, which is exactly why I did not just give you $50 million. His face contorted in rage. "You ungrateful brat," he shouted, taking a step toward my desk. "I am giving you the chance to redeem yourself. I am giving you the chance to finally be a part of this family again. If you do not transfer those funds by the time I leave this office, I swear to God, I will march straight to Richard Montgomery and tell him everything about your past. I will tell him you are a thief. I will tell him you are a fraud. I will make sure you are ruined in every elite circle in this state." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I slowly reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder. I placed it on the marble surface and slid it across the desk toward him. The folder stopped right at his fingertips. He looked down at it, his chest heaving with angry breaths. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its aggressive edge. "You said your business is facing a temporary cash flow issue," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on his. "But we both know that is a lie. Your real estate firm is bankrupt, Reginald. You defaulted on 3 major commercial loans last month. You owe $45 million to the bank, and they were preparing to seize every single asset you own by tomorrow morning." He stared at me, the color rapidly draining from his face. "How do you know that?" he whispered. "I know that because I do my research," I said, leaning forward slightly. "And I also know that the bank was looking to offload that toxic debt to the highest bidder. So I made them an offer." I tapped the thick legal folder with my index finger. "I did not give you $50 million, Reginald, because I bought your debt instead." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The ambient noise of the city 40 floors below seemed to vanish entirely. My father stood frozen like a statue, staring at the thick manila folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He did not reach out to open it. He did not need to. The horrible realization was already washing over him, dismantling his arrogance piece by piece. His breath became shallow and rapid. "You cannot possibly mean that," he stammered, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "The bank would never sell my debt to a third party without notifying my legal team. They are legally obligated to inform me." I smiled, resting my chin on my folded hands. "Actually, they are only obligated to inform you once the transaction is completely finalized. And since the final signatures were processed at 8 o'clock this morning, the certified mail is probably arriving at your house right about now. While you were busy driving over here to demand money to save your sinking ship, I was already steering it straight into the rocks." He finally reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the cover of the folder. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the pages, reading the highlighted sections, showing the transfer of $45 million in defaulted commercial loans from his primary lender to Aura Sync Holdings. The very company he had mocked mere moments ago was now holding the deed to his entire life. The country club memberships and the luxury cars and the sprawling estate in Maryland, where my mother was currently hosting her elite friends, were all tied to the assets securing these loans. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. "You own my debt," he said quietly, as if saying the words out loud would make them less real. "Every single penny," I confirmed. "I am your sole creditor now, Reginald. And unlike the bank, I am not interested in negotiating an extension or a favorable repayment plan. I am calling the debt in full." You have until 5 o'clock this evening to either sign over 100% of your real estate holdings to Orasync, or I will initiate the foreclosure process. By the time Brianna walks down the aisle to marry Spencer Montgomery tomorrow, you will be publicly and humiliatingly bankrupt. He stumbled backward, bumping into one of the imported leather chairs. He collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. The polished, wealthy real estate tycoon was gone, replaced by a broken and desperate man. "You cannot do this," he pleaded, looking up at me with watering eyes. "Nyla, please. This is your family legacy. I spent 30 years building that company. I sacrificed everything to give us a name in this county." "You did not build a legacy," I corrected, my voice hardening. "You built an illusion. You stole from your own mother to fund your early projects. You stole my grandmother's trust fund to save yourself from ruin 10 years ago, and you tried to ruin my life to cover your tracks. You traded my future for your comfort. You tossed me out into the snow with nothing and told me I was a failure. You built a house of cards, Reginald, and now I am simply removing the bottom piece." He jumped out of the chair, suddenly angry again. "If you destroy me, I will destroy you," he yelled, pointing at me wildly. "I will go to Richard Montgomery tonight. I will tell him about the jewelry theft. I will tell him his precious future daughter-in-law comes from a family with a criminal sister. The Montgomerys despise scandal. Richard will pull his support, and Spencer will cancel the wedding. You will be responsible for ruining Brianna's life." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. "Oh, please do," I encouraged him. "Please go to Richard Montgomery and tell him whatever lies you want to invent about me. Tell him I am a thief. Tell him I am a terrible person. Because I promise you, Richard Montgomery cares far more about my billion-dollar supply chain algorithm than he cares about some fabricated teenage drama from a decade ago. In fact, I think it is time I properly introduced myself to my new in-laws." My father stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind unable to process the absolute shift in power. "You are bluffing," he spat out, but he was backing away toward the door. I reached over and pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Security, please come up to the executive suite," I said clearly. "My guest is ready to leave, and make sure he does not take any complimentary water bottles from the lobby on his way out. He cannot afford them anymore." 2 massive security guards appeared at the doors almost instantly. My father looked at them, then back at me, his face a mask of pure hatred and terror. "This is not over, Nyla," he threatened as the guards took him by the arms. "You will regret this." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. "Actually, Reginald, I think this is just beginning," I replied. "And do me a favor. Tell Vivian to set an extra plate for the engagement party tonight. I have decided to attend after all, and I am bringing a +1. My lawyer." I watched the doors close behind him, listening to his muffled protests as they escorted him down the hall. I turned back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city that was now firmly in the palm of my hand. My phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up and opened a text message from my private investigator. "The bank records from 10 years ago are ready, boss. Do you want me to bring them to the country club tonight?" I typed a single word back. "Yes." The trap was perfectly set, and the Montgomery family was about to witness the most expensive and devastating show of their lives. I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it into my suit pocket. The silence of my office was no longer a void, but a symphony of anticipated victory. I walked into the private suite attached to my office. My assistant had already brought up the garment bag I requested earlier that morning. I unzipped the heavy black canvas to reveal the dress I had commissioned for this exact occasion. It was a custom haute couture gown, crafted by a private designer in Milan. It was cut from liquid silk in a deep emerald green that caught the light like a gemstone. It was not loud or covered in cheap crystals, like the dresses my mother and sister favored. It was a dress that commanded the room through pure, unadulterated power. I spent the next 2 hours preparing myself for the evening. I washed away the corporate armor of the day and replaced it with the elegance of a woman who owned the world. As I applied my makeup, I looked into the mirror. and thought about the scared 19-year-old girl who used to cry in the bathroom of her parents' house. That girl used to believe she was fundamentally broken because her own family treated her like a disease. She used to look in the mirror and search for the flaws her mother constantly pointed out. I traced the line of my jaw and smiled. That girl was gone. She had been forged in the fire of their rejection and hardened into unbreakable steel. I stepped into the private elevator and rode it down to the underground parking garage. My driver was waiting beside the sleek black Maybach with the engine already running. He opened the door for me with a respectful nod. I slid into the luxurious leather-back seat and gave him the address of the country club. The drive through Maryland was a journey through my past. We passed the sprawling neighborhoods of Prince George County, where the black elite built their mansions and hosted their exclusive galas. My parents had spent their entire lives clawing their way up the social ladder in these very neighborhoods. They obsessed over country club memberships and charity board seats and rubbing elbows with generational wealth. They viewed my sister Brianna as their golden ticket to ultimate social supremacy. By marrying Spencer Montgomery, she was tying our family to a white billionaire dynasty. The Montgomery family represented everything my parents worshipped. They were old money. They were untouchable. And they were about to be utterly humiliated by the daughter my parents had tried to bury. I watched the luxury homes blur past my tinted window. My father, Reginald, had built his real estate firm by exploiting these very communities, and now he was drowning in $45 million of debt that I controlled. He was probably at the country club right now, smiling and shaking hands with the Montgomery family while a countdown clock ticked toward his absolute financial ruin. I wondered if he was sweating through his tuxedo. I wondered if he had told my mother about our little meeting in my office. Knowing his suffocating pride, he had probably kept his mouth shut, hoping a miracle would save him before the clock struck midnight. There would be no miracles tonight. Only consequences. The Maybach pulled through the towering iron gates of the exclusive country club. The winding driveway was lined with manicured oak trees covered in glittering fairy lights. Valets were rushing back and forth, parking a parade of imported luxury vehicles. When my driver pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet rushed over and opened my door. I stepped out into the crisp evening air. The valet froze for a fraction of a second, taking in the sheer presence of my emerald gown and the diamonds resting against my collarbone. I did not wear the jewelry my mother had falsely accused me of stealing 10 years ago. I wore diamonds I had purchased with my own dividends. I handed the valet $100 bill and walked up the sweeping stone staircase toward the grand ballroom. The heavy oak doors were propped open, and the sound of a live string quartet drifted out into the foyer. I paused at the threshold and took a slow, deliberate breath. This was the lion den. This was the epicenter of fake smiles and toxic gossip and generational wealth. I stepped through the doors and into the dazzling light of the ballroom. The space was packed with 300 of the most elite figures in the state. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. The room was a sea of silk and velvet and expensive cologne. It took less than 30 seconds for the whispers to begin. Heads began to turn in my direction. Conversations trailed off into hushed murmurs. I held my head high and walked slowly into the room. I could feel the collective weight of their stares. Most of these people had not seen me in 5 years. They had been fed lies by my parents. They had been told I was a troubled dropout who had moved away in shame. Now they were staring at a woman who looked like she owned the very ground they were standing on. It did not take long for the panic to set in. From across the room, I spotted my mother, Vivian. She was standing near the towering champagne fountain, holding court with a group of wealthy older women. She was wearing a heavily beaded gold dress that looked completely desperate for attention. When her eyes locked onto mine, the color instantly drained from her face. She dropped her crystal champagne flute, and it shattered against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound caused a ripple of silence to spread through her immediate circle. I offered her a polite, chilling smile. She excused herself from the group and marched toward me with a furious, terrifying speed. She looked like a predator closing in on its prey, but she was severely underestimating the prey. She grabbed my arm with her manicured claws, digging her nails into my skin. Her eyes were wide with panic and rage as she leaned in close, so the other guests could not hear her venom. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her breath smelling of expensive alcohol and fear. "I told you not to come. You are a stain on this family. Leave this building immediately before Richard Montgomery sees you." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the sheer coldness of my gaze, and slowly released her grip. "I told you I would not be wearing a cheap thrift store suit, Vivian." I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and unbothered. "I think this custom silk suits the occasion quite well. Do you not agree?" Her face twisted with pure hatred. "You think this is a game?" she whispered frantically, glancing over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching us. "You think you can just show up here and ruin the most important night of your sister's life? The Montgomery family is royalty in this state. They are an old money white dynasty, and they do not associate with failures. If they find out who you really are, they will cancel this engagement. You are going to walk out those doors right now, or I will have the club manager drag you out by your hair." Before I could explain to my mother that I could buy this entire country club and turn it into a parking lot, a shrill and panicked voice interrupted us. "Mom, what is she doing here?" I turned to see my sister Brianna rushing toward us. She was wearing a massive white engagement dress that was drowning in tulle and lace. She looked like a giant over-decorated pastry. Clinging to her arm was her fiancé, Spencer Montgomery. He was tall and blonde with the kind of smug, relaxed posture that only came from a lifetime of never having to work for anything. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket and a condescending smile. Brianna looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes darted between me and Spencer, as if she was trying to calculate how to contain the damage of my presence. She immediately tightened her grip on Spencer's arm and leaned into him, playing the role of the fragile and victimized bride-to-be. "Spencer, honey," Brianna said, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "This is my troubled little sister I warned you about, the one who dropped out of medical school and steals from the family. She always lies for attention, and she must have sneaked in here to ruin my special night." Spencer looked at me from head to toe. His gaze was arrogant and dismissive. He was evaluating me based on the lies my sister had fed him. He thought he was looking at a desperate unemployed criminal who was trying to leech off her wealthy relatives. "Well, it is incredibly inappropriate for you to be here," Spencer said, his tone dripping with elite white privilege. "This is a private event for respectable members of society. I suggest you listen to your mother and leave before I have my personal security team escort you off the premises. We do not tolerate uninvited disruptions." I looked at Spencer and then at Brianna. My sister was smirking slightly, hiding behind the shield of her powerful future husband. My mother stood beside them, looking relieved that Spencer had taken control of the situation. They all thought they had won. They all thought they had successfully boxed me into the corner of shame and submission. They thought their combined social status was enough to crush me into dust. I let out a soft, elegant laugh that cut through their smug superiority. My laughter was not defensive or angry. It was the sound of a woman who held the remote control to a nuclear bomb. "Are you going to have me escorted out, Spencer?" I asked, tilting my head. "That would be quite a shame. I was just hoping to discuss some business with your father." Brianna gasped dramatically. "You stay away from Richard Montgomery," she commanded, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He is a billionaire. He does not have time to listen to the delusional rambling of a college dropout." My mother stepped forward, trying to physically block my path toward the center of the ballroom. "You are insane," Nyla Vivian hissed. "You are completely unhinged. If you take one step toward Richard Montgomery, I will personally call the police and tell them you are trespassing and harassing our guests. I will remind them of your criminal record from 10 years ago. I will make sure you spend the night in a jail cell." I looked down at my mother, taking in the absolute desperation in her eyes. She was so terrified of losing her social standing that she was willing to throw her own daughter into a police car based on a fabricated crime. She had not changed at all in the last 10 years. She was the exact same toxic, manipulative woman who had stood by while my father drained my trust fund. The only difference was that today I was no longer a defenseless 19-year-old girl. I checked the diamond watch on my wrist. It was perfectly timed. My private investigator was already in the building and the documents were secured. More importantly, I knew exactly where Richard Montgomery was standing. I looked past the three of them, scanning the crowded ballroom. Near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of local politicians and business leaders, stood the ruthless retail billionaire himself. Richard Montgomery was a silver-haired shark who dominated the corporate world with absolute efficiency. He was the man my family was desperately trying to impress. He was the man who could elevate their social status to the absolute pinnacle of the Maryland elite, and he was currently staring directly at me with his mouth slightly open. I turned my attention back to my sister and her arrogant fiancé. Spencer was already signaling for one of the club managers to come over. Brianna was adjusting her dress, trying to look composed. Vivian was still glaring at me, her chest heaving with silent rage. I smiled at them, a genuine warm smile that clearly unsettled all three of them. "I do not think you will need to call security, Spencer," I said softly. "I think your father is about to come over here and introduce himself." Spencer scoffed, rolling his eyes. "My father does not associate with street trash." But Spencer's words faded into the background as a heavy, authoritative voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. "Good God, is that Nyla?" The voice was booming and undeniable. It belonged to Richard Montgomery. I watched as the crowd naturally parted, allowing the billionaire to stride purposefully across the marble floor. He was not looking at Spencer. He was not looking at Brianna. He was not looking at Vivian. He was looking exclusively at me, and he was walking faster than a man his age usually did. The panic that washed over my family was absolute poetry. They froze in place, entirely unsure of how to process the unfolding scene. The trap had been triggered, and the most devastating show of their lives was about to commence. Every single eye in the grand ballroom tracked Richard Montgomery as he made his way toward our tense little circle. The string quartet seemed to play a little softer, as if the musicians themselves sensed the gravitational shift in the room. My mother visibly straightened her posture and forced a painfully fake smile onto her face, assuming the billionaire was coming over to greet her and her brilliant daughter Brianna. She quickly reached out and tried to shove me behind her, hoping to hide my existence from the patriarch of the Montgomery dynasty. But I simply stepped to the side, refusing to be moved into the shadows. Spencer puffed out his chest, preparing to defend his fragile fiancée from the embarrassment of my presence. Brianna clutched her designer purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were all bracing for impact, but they were bracing for the wrong collision entirely. I stood perfectly still, my emerald gown catching the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above us. I did not shrink, and I did not look away. I waited with the serene patience of a woman who held every single winning card in the deck. The next few moments would completely obliterate the fragile house of lies my parents had spent 10 years building. The elite society of Prince George County was about to witness a spectacular execution, and I was the one holding the blade. The heavy and authoritative voice of Richard Montgomery cut through the ambient noise of the opulent ballroom like a sharpened blade. I watched as the sea of wealthy guests naturally parted to allow the silver-haired billionaire to stride purposefully across the polished marble floor. He was moving with a desperate kind of speed that completely betrayed his usual composed and terrifying demeanor. My mother Vivian immediately straightened her posture and smoothed down the front of her heavily beaded gold dress. She forced a painfully bright smile onto her face, clearly assuming that the patriarch of the Montgomery dynasty was rushing over to greet her and officially welcome her into their elite social circle. She reached out and grabbed my arm again, trying to shove me backward into the shadows so I would not ruin her perfect moment of social triumph. Brianna puffed out her chest and adjusted her massive white engagement dress, preparing to accept the ultimate validation from her future father-in-law. Spencer stood taller beside her, expecting his father to back him up and help security throw me out into the cold night. They were all bracing themselves for a glorious family victory, but they were bracing for the wrong collision entirely. I did not step back into the shadows, and I did not lower my gaze. I stood perfectly still, my custom emerald silk gown catching the light from the towering crystal chandeliers above us. I waited with the serene patience of a woman who held every single winning card in the deck and was ready to lay them down one by one. Richard Montgomery reached our tense little circle, but he did not slow down to acknowledge my mother. Vivian stepped forward, extending her manicured hand and opening her mouth to deliver a rehearsed and sycophantic greeting. Richard did not even look at her. He brushed past my mother with such forceful momentum that she stumbled backward and nearly collided with the edge of the towering champagne fountain. He completely ignored his son Spencer, who was standing there with a smug grin. He did not spare a single glance for Brianna standing there, in her excessive tulle and lace, looking like a desperate bride waiting for a blessing. He stopped directly in front of me and extended both of his hands. His face was flushed red with a mixture of sheer awe and absolute desperation. He grabbed my hands and shook them, with a fervor that bordered on religious worship. He said my name with a reverence that echoed through the sudden and suffocating quiet of the ballroom. He told me he could not believe I was actually standing here in front of him. He looked at me as if I were a savior descending from the sky to rescue his failing empire. He told me that his entire executive team had been begging my office for a simple 15-minute meeting for the past 6 months, and my assistant kept turning them down week after week. He said it was an absolute honor to finally meet me in person and that he had been following my career trajectory with immense admiration. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing all at once. The live string quartet playing in the corner of the room faltered as the cellist lost his place, completely distracted by the bizarre scene unfolding in the center of the floor. The music died out, leaving only the sound of Richard's heavy breathing and the faint clinking of crystal glasses as the wealthy guests stared in absolute shock. I looked past the billionaire to observe my family, and the sight was more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. Vivian's jaw had literally dropped open. Her eyes were wide and darting frantically back and forth between my calm face and Richard's hands gripping mine so desperately. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land, unable to comprehend how the daughter she had just called a worthless stain was currently being worshipped by the most powerful man in the state. Brianna looked as though someone had just physically slapped her across the face. The smug superiority she had held just seconds ago was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow and terrifying confusion. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and sickly against her stark white dress. Spencer was the first person to break the heavy silence. His voice was weak and trembling, completely stripped of its former elite arrogance. He stammered, looking at his father with utter bewilderment. He asked his father if he actually knew who I was. He pointed a shaking finger at me and referred to me as Brianna's unemployed and troubled sister. Richard Montgomery dropped my hands and turned slowly to face his son. The look of profound disgust on the billionaire's face was absolute and chilling. He let out a loud and booming laugh that carried zero humor whatsoever. It was a harsh laugh of pure disbelief at his son's profound ignorance. He asked Spencer if he was a complete and total idiot. His voice rang out over the silent crowd, ensuring that every single member of the Prince George's County elite could hear him clearly. He pointed a commanding finger at me and declared to the entire room that I was not unemployed. He announced with absolute certainty that I was the chief executive officer of Orasync. He told his son that my supply chain algorithm was the single most valuable piece of technology in the country, and it was the very thing they needed to save their retail empire from completely going under. He did not stop there. He made sure to add the final devastating nail to the coffin by stating loudly that I was worth over $1 billion. The collective gasp from the 300 wealthy guests was audible. The murmurs erupted instantly as the socialites and politicians turned to each other, realizing they were in the presence of a true titan of industry and that the family hosting the party had been treating a billionaire like absolute garbage. I turned my attention back to my mother and sister. They were physically trembling now, their entire fabricated reality collapsing around them in real time. The elite society they had spent their entire lives trying to impress was now staring at them with intense scrutiny and judgment. I offered Vivian a sweet and perfectly calibrated smile. I spoke softly, but I ensured my voice carried perfectly in the hushed room. I told Richard Montgomery that his words were so incredibly strange. I explained to him that my mother had just finished telling me that I was a disgusting stain on the family and that I needed to be removed from the premises before I embarrassed them all. I watched Richard's eyes widen in shock as he processed this information. He looked at my mother with a mixture of confusion and deep revulsion. Then I slowly turned my gaze to Brianna, who was shrinking into her massive dress, trying to make herself as small as possible. I added that my sister had just called me this morning begging me for $2 million to pay for this very engagement party because our father was completely bankrupt and facing immediate foreclosure. The silence that followed was heavy and lethal. The truth hung in the air, exposing my family as the broke and desperate social climbers they truly were. The whispers in the room grew louder as the guests realized the engagement party they were attending was funded by empty promises and staggering debt. The sheer weight of the moment pressed down on everyone standing in the grand foyer of the country club. I stood there in my emerald gown, feeling the cool air from the open terrace brush against my skin, while my family slowly suffocated under the weight of their own exposed lies. The Montgomery family was not just wealthy, they were the gatekeepers of the highest social tier in the state. For my mother, Vivian, securing an alliance with them was supposed to be the ultimate vindication of her entire superficial existence. She had sacrificed my mental health, my college fund, and my basic human dignity just to ensure Brianna had the perfect, polished background to present to people like Spencer and Richard. And now the very man who held the keys to that kingdom was looking at her as if she were a cockroach that had scurried across his expensive imported rug. The contrast between the way Richard Montgomery looked at me and the way he looked at my mother was a masterclass in social execution. He looked at me with the reverence reserved for a peer, a titan, a savior. He looked at her with the cold, calculating disdain of a man who has just realized he is being conned by a small-time hustler. I watched Spencer struggle to process the information his father had just screamed at him. Spencer had spent his entire life coasting on the accomplishments of his ancestors, assuming that his last name alone made him the smartest and most important person in any room he entered. Brianna had fed his ego perfectly, playing the role of the devoted and slightly inferior partner who looked up to him with wide, adoring eyes. She had told him I was a failure because it made her look like the successful, resilient sibling who had overcome the tragedy of a troubled sister. Spencer had gladly accepted this narrative because it required zero critical thinking and allowed him to feel benevolent for associating with her family. But hearing his own father, the man whose wealth funded Spencer's lavish and lazy lifestyle, declare that I was the only person capable of saving their retail empire caused a visible short-circuit in his brain. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no words came out. He looked from his furious father to my calm face, and then down at Brianna, who was literally trembling beside him. The polished velvet tuxedo jacket he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a boy who was playing dress-up in a world of serious adults. The silence in the room was finally broken by the clattering of silverware as a shocked waiter dropped a tray of appetizers near the buffet tables. The sound made my mother jump, causing her heavily beaded dress to rustle loudly in the quiet space. She was a woman who had meticulously planned every second of this evening, down to the specific vintage of champagne being served and the exact placement of the floral arrangements. She had coordinated with photographers to ensure her image would be plastered across local society magazines by next week. She had intended to use this night to cement her status as the matriarch of a powerful and thriving dynasty. Instead, She was standing in the center of the ballroom, completely exposed as a fraud, a liar, and a terrible mother. The elite guests who she had spent years trying to impress were now whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between my glittering diamond necklace and my mother's panicked expression. The local politicians who had previously smiled at her were now physically stepping back, distancing themselves from the impending fallout. In the high society of Prince George County, going bankrupt was a sin, but lying about it to the Montgomery family was an absolute death sentence. I let the silence stretch for a few more agonizing seconds, allowing the reality of my words to sink deep into the marrow of their bones. I wanted them to feel the precise moment their future evaporated. I wanted Brianna to feel the icy chill of Spencer's withdrawal as he subtly shifted his weight away from her, releasing his grip on her hand. He was a coward at heart, and faced with his father's wrath and my overwhelming superiority, his first instinct was to abandon the sinking ship. Brianna felt the movement, and her eyes widened in sheer terror. She reached out and grabbed his arm again, her manicured nails digging into his velvet sleeve, but the damage was already done. The illusion of their perfect romance was shattered, revealing the transactional nature of their entire relationship. They did not love each other. They loved the status they believed the other provided. And now that my sister brought no status and no money to the table, she was entirely useless to him. Richard Montgomery took a step closer to me, completely ignoring the pathetic display of my mother and sister. His voice softened slightly, taking on a tone of deep professional respect. He told me that his supply chain logistics had been hemorrhaging capital for the past 4 quarters, and that his analysts had concluded that my proprietary algorithm was the only viable solution in the global market. He confessed that he had personally mandated his executive board to secure a contract with Orasync at any cost, but my acquisitions team had stonewalled them. He looked at me with a desperate kind of hope, asking if there was any possibility we could arrange a private meeting to discuss a merger or a licensing agreement. He promised that the Montgomery retail empire would offer unprecedented terms and that he was prepared to sign a letter of intent immediately. He was essentially begging me for a lifeline in front of the exact people who had spent my entire life telling me I was a worthless burden. I smiled at Richard, maintaining perfect eye contact. I told him that I appreciated his candor and his relentless pursuit of excellence. I explained that my calendar was notoriously difficult to navigate, but that I respected a man who understood the value of true innovation. I told him that my assistant would reach out to his office on Monday morning to schedule a preliminary discussion, but that I could make no promises regarding a final agreement. I emphasized that Orasync only partnered with entities that demonstrated absolute integrity and flawless operational transparency. I let my gaze drift slowly over to my mother and sister as I said those words, ensuring that Richard understood the subtle implication. If he wanted my business, he would have to distance himself completely from the fraudulent mess of my biological family. Richard was a shark, and he understood the subtext immediately. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Vivian and Brianna, realizing that any association with them would actively jeopardize his chance at saving his company. The calculation was instantaneous and ruthless. He was already severing the ties in his mind, preparing to throw my family to the wolves to secure my favor. The sheer panic radiating from my mother was almost a tangible force in the ballroom. She watched Richard Montgomery, the man she had worshipped as a god, implicitly agree to my terms and subtly turn his back on her. She saw her exclusive country club memberships, her carefully curated social standing, and her golden daughter's lavish future dissolving into dirty smoke. The survival instinct of a desperate social climber is a truly terrifying thing to witness firsthand. In a fraction of a single second, Vivian abandoned all of her previous hatred and resentment toward me. She shoved her massive pride down into the dark abyss of her soul and prepared to launch into a performance that would require an astonishing level of pure delusion. She knew deep down that her only chance to save herself and her favorite child from social ruin was to somehow convince Richard Montgomery that my unprecedented success was a direct result of their loving and supportive family environment. She was about to stand in front of the most powerful people in Maryland and try to claim total credit for the billion-dollar empire I had built with my own bleeding hands after she had heartlessly thrown me out into the freezing street. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable and sickeningly desperate lie to leave her trembling lips. Vivian let out a shrill and piercing laugh that sounded like glass shattering in the quiet room. She threw her head back, pretending to find the entire situation incredibly amusing. She stepped forward and grabbed my arm again, but this time her touch was sickeningly affectionate. She patted my hand and looked at Richard Montgomery with wide and innocent eyes. "Oh, Richard, you completely misunderstood our little family humor," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are always teasing each other like this. We are just so incredibly proud of Nyla and everything she has accomplished." Richard paused, his silver eyebrows pulling together in slight confusion. Vivian did not give him a chance to process the sudden shift in her demeanor. She rushed ahead, weaving a masterclass of absolute fiction right in front of the Prince George's County elite. "In fact, Orasync is actually a family business," Vivian declared loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the wealthy guests standing nearby. "Reginald and I recognized Nyla's potential years ago. We provided all the seed money and the initial investment to get the company off the ground. We gave her the financial foundation she needed to build this empire, because that is what loving parents do." I stared at my mother, marveling at the sheer velocity of her deceit. She had just looked a billionaire in the eye and claimed to have funded the very company I built while starving in a cramped studio apartment after she deliberately cut off my basic living expenses to punish me. But before I could even open my mouth to dismantle her ridiculous and pathetic claim, my older sister saw her narrow window of opportunity. Brianna realized that our mother's bold lie was the only life raft available in this vast ocean of public humiliation. She immediately dropped her fragile victim act and shifted effortlessly into the role of the humble and brilliant corporate mastermind. Brianna stepped away from the shadows and linked her arm firmly through Spencer's, releasing a soft and modest sigh that made my stomach churn. "Yes, it is completely true," Brianna chimed in, looking up at Spencer with adoring eyes and then over to his powerful father. "Nyla is the beautiful face of the company because I am simply too busy with my demanding medical career to handle the tedious day-to-day operations. But I actually wrote the core business model for her. I developed the initial mathematical framework for the supply chain algorithm during my late nights at the clinic. We are equal partners. We built this massive enterprise together as a united family." The absolute audacity of my sister made my blood run cold. Brianna could barely manage the basic scheduling software at her dermatology clinic. Yet she was standing in front of a room full of titans, claiming she had engineered a globally dominant artificial intelligence algorithm. She was trying to steal the credit for the thousands of hours I had spent staring at a glowing screen until my eyes burned. She was trying to steal the nights I fell asleep at my desk, praying that my code would compile so I could afford to pay my heating bill. She was doing what she had done her entire life. She was taking my hard work and pasting her own name over it. And the most infuriating part was that she delivered the lie with such practiced conviction that the people in the room actually began to believe it. I watched the shifting expressions on the faces of the Montgomery men. Richard Montgomery was a man who valued dynastic wealth and family legacies above all else. The idea of a powerful family unit working together to dominate a market appealed directly to his old money sensibilities. His initial disgust toward my mother and sister began to fade, replaced by a look of intrigued approval. He looked from Vivian to Brianna, and then back to me, nodding his head slowly. "Ah, so the Montgomerys and your family are truly merging two brilliant empires," Richard said, his booming voice echoing with newfound satisfaction. "I must say I am thoroughly impressed. Building a $1 billion tech firm as a family endeavor is a remarkable feat. You raised two incredibly formidable daughters, Vivian. Spencer Montgomery instantly puffed his chest back out. His fragile ego, which had been completely shattered just moments ago, was suddenly inflated by the delusion that he was marrying into a family of secret tech billionaires. He wrapped his arm around Brianna's waist, pulling her close and kissing the side of her head. He looked at me with a renewed sense of arrogant validation. "I always knew my fiancée was a genius," Spencer declared to the surrounding crowd. "She is just too humble to brag about her corporate achievements." It takes a truly special woman to balance a medical career while secretly running a tech empire behind the scenes. The wealthy guests in the ballroom began to murmur in awe. The local politicians who had previously stepped away from my mother were now edging closer again, eager to associate with the creators of AuraSync. The illusion of their perfect and elite family was miraculously restored and elevated to an entirely new stratosphere. My parents looked like they had just pulled off the heist of the century. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand ballroom, letting their sickening lies wash over me. Any other person might have screamed. They might have lost their temper and yelled out the truth, throwing wild accusations and making a chaotic scene. But I did not raise my voice. I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. I knew that losing my composure would only play into the narrative they had spent years crafting about me being the unstable and dramatic black sheep of the family. Instead, I embraced the deadly power of absolute silence. I let them enjoy their stolen glory for a few long and agonizing seconds. I looked at my mother, who was beaming with fake maternal pride. I looked at Spencer, who was preening like a peacock. And finally, I locked eyes with my sister. I gave Brianna a slow and dead-eyed smile that held absolutely zero warmth. It was a smile devoid of any human emotion. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey wander blindly into an inescapable trap. Brianna's triumphant expression faltered slightly as she met my gaze. She could see the absolute lack of forgiveness in my eyes, but she was in too deep to back down now. "You wrote the business model, Brianna?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and melodic. The question floated through the quiet space, forcing the surrounding guests to lean in closer to hear our exchange. "Yes," Brianna replied, lifting her chin defiantly, though I could see a faint tremor in her neck. "It was a collaborative effort, of course, but the core structural logistics were my design. I just wanted you to have the spotlight, Nyla, since you struggled so much in your early 20s. "That is fascinating," I said slowly, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "It truly is remarkable how you managed to engineer a $1 billion logistics framework between your dermatology appointments. You are a woman of endless and surprising talents." My mother stepped forward again, eager to keep the momentum of their lie moving forward. She clapped her hands together, emitting another shrill laugh. "Well, now that everything is out in the open, we should truly celebrate," Vivian announced to the crowd. "This is a night for family and for new beginnings. Let us get back to the music and the champagne. We have a wedding to plan and a corporate merger to celebrate." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, distancing myself from their toxic and suffocating circle. I reached down into the small, emerald silk clutch I was holding in my left hand. My fingers brushed past my lipstick and wrapped securely around the smooth, cold metal of a small USB drive. It was a device that contained the absolute digital execution of my entire biological family. It was the weapon I had prepared for this exact moment. "Since this is a family business," I said, my voice cutting clearly and sharply through the rising, excited chatter of the ballroom, "I think it is only right that we share some intimate behind-the-scenes family moments with our future in-laws." Richard Montgomery looked highly intrigued, fully expecting a heartwarming slideshow presentation of our supposed collaborative corporate journey toward becoming billionaires. Vivian and Brianna looked suddenly confused and deeply unsettled, unsure of what exactly I was talking about or what I was planning to show the wealthy crowd. I did not offer them any further explanation. I turned my back on my panicked mother and my lying sister and walked casually over to the elevated DJ booth that overlooked the massive mahogany dance floor. The technician working the complicated sound system looked up at me in absolute surprise as I approached his station in my custom gown. I handed him the small silver flash drive and gave him a set of very specific and uncompromising instructions. The greedy people who had just tried to steal the credit for my entire life were about to have their own fraudulent lives permanently and publicly dismantled. I was going to make absolutely certain that every single billionaire politician and socialite in that room heard every single devastating second of it. The real show was finally ready to begin. The DJ booth was located on a slightly elevated platform overlooking the massive mahogany dance floor of the country club. I walked toward it with the slow and deliberate pace of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose and an entire empire to gain. The heavy silk of my emerald gown brushed against the polished wood as I climbed the 3 short steps to the sound station. The technician standing behind the mixing board was a young man wearing a black vest and a headset resting around his neck. He looked incredibly nervous as I approached him. He had been watching the intense interaction between my family and the Montgomery patriarch, and he clearly understood that whatever was happening was entirely above his pay grade. I reached out and placed the small silver USB drive onto the surface of his soundboard. My instructions to him were remarkably simple, but they carried the weight of a 10-year execution. I told him to plug the drive into his primary system and play the single audio file located in the main folder. I also instructed him to route the visual feed from the drive directly to the massive monogrammed projection screens that were currently displaying my sister and Spencer's intertwined initials on the walls behind the main stage. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the club manager who was standing paralyzed near the buffet tables. But the sheer authority in my voice and the fact that the most powerful billionaire in the state was currently waiting for my presentation compelled him to obey. He plugged the silver drive into his laptop. I turned back around to face the ballroom, resting my hands lightly on the railing of the DJ booth. I had the perfect vantage point to observe the absolute destruction of my biological family. From this elevated position, I could see every single face in the crowd. I could see Richard Montgomery standing with his arms crossed, his silver eyebrows furrowed in deep curiosity. I could see his son Spencer looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. And right in the center of it all, I could see my mother Vivian and my sister Brianna. They looked like 2 animals caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. They had no idea what was on that flash drive, but their guilty consciences were already suffocating them. Vivian was clutching the beaded fabric of her gold dress so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. Brianna was chewing on her bottom lip, her pristine bridal makeup unable to hide the sheer terror radiating from her eyes. They had built their entire lives on maintaining a flawless public image. They had sacrificed my well-being to ensure that nobody in this elite social circle ever saw the ugly and toxic reality of their behavior. And now the curtain was finally being ripped away. The young technician pressed a button on his mixing board. The ambient background music that had been quietly playing through the ballroom speakers abruptly cut off, leaving a heavy and expectant silence in its wake. A second later, the sound system crackled to life. The speakers in the country club were designed to amplify music across a massive space, which meant that the audio file I had provided was broadcast with crystal clear and devastating volume. The sound that filled the elegant room was not a heartwarming family speech or a nostalgic childhood video. It was the frantic, shrill, and deeply unhinged voice of my sister Brianna, recorded just hours ago from the voicemail she had left on my phone. "What the hell did you do?" her recorded voice screamed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. "How did you pay for a fake magazine cover on the day of my engagement?" The sheer volume and aggression in the audio made several guests physically flinch. Spencer Montgomery stepped away from Brianna, his face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. But the recording did not stop. It continued to play, broadcasting every single vile and venomous word she had spoken that morning. "What kind of sick joke is this?" The recorded Brianna shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "How did a college dropout piece of trash like you get on Forbes? You are a leech. You are a complete failure. You are a pathetic nobody, and you are trying to ruin my life. You need to take this down right now before I call the police." The audio file ended with a sharp click, leaving the ballroom plunging back into a silence so profound and heavy that it felt like the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the room. The echo of Brianna's screaming voice seemed to linger in the air, wrapping around the wealthy guests and suffocating the last remaining shreds of my family's dignity. I stood perfectly still in the DJ booth, looking down at the absolute wreckage I had just caused. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Brianna turned completely ghost white. All the blood rushed from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow shell of the confident woman who had been bragging just moments ago. She raised both of her trembling hands to cover her mouth, but it was far too late to stop the damage. Her carefully curated persona of the sweet, elegant, and brilliant doctor was utterly annihilated. She had just been exposed to her elite future in-laws and 300 wealthy guests as a foul-mouthed, deeply insecure, and violently jealous bully. My mother? Vivian looked as though her knees were going to give out. She swayed on her expensive heels, grabbing onto a nearby cocktail table just to keep herself upright. She had just told Richard Montgomery that our family was a loving and collaborative unit that had worked together to build a billion-dollar empire. And now the entire room had just listened to her golden child screaming insults and calling me a piece of trash. The absolute contradiction between her sickeningly sweet lies and the toxic reality of that voicemail was impossible to ignore. Spencer Montgomery was staring at Brianna with an expression of pure horror. He was a man who valued decorum and elite manners above everything else. Hearing his supposedly perfect fiancée screaming like a deranged lunatic on a recorded voicemail violated every single social rule he had been raised to respect. But I was not finished. The audio trap was only the first part of the execution. I turned to the technician and gave him a single nod. He immediately switched the visual feed on the massive projection screens hanging on the walls of the ballroom. The romantic monogram of Brianna and Spencer's intertwined initials vanished in an instant. In its place, a crisp and highly detailed legal document was projected for the entire room to see. The text was large enough that even the guests standing in the back of the room could read it clearly. It was the official capitalization table and ownership structure of Orasync Holdings. The document displayed the exact distribution of equity and financial control within the company. Right at the top, in bold black letters, was my name, Nyla. And right next to it was the percentage of ownership, 100%. I picked up a wireless microphone that was resting on the soundboard. I turned it on and let my voice project smoothly through the same speakers that had just broadcast my sister's humiliating tantrum. As you can clearly see on the screens behind me, I announced my tone perfectly calm and devastatingly polite. I retain 100% equity ownership of Orasync. There are no secondary partners. There is no family board of directors. There is zero family investment. And there has been zero family involvement since the day this company was founded. I walked slowly down the steps of the DJ booth, keeping my eyes locked on the crowd. The wealthy guests parted from me once again, treating me with a mixture of immense respect and quiet terror. I had just dismantled my own family in front of the entire county, and I had done it without raising my voice a single decibel. I walked directly back to the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from Richard Montgomery. The billionaire patriarch was staring at the projection screens, his sharp eyes analyzing the financial documents with expert precision. He could read a capitalization table better than anyone in the room, and he knew exactly what those numbers meant. He knew that my mother and sister had just looked him directly in the face and lied to him with absolute brazen audacity. They had tried to claim ownership of an empire they had absolutely no part in building. I looked at Mr. Montgomery and offered him a small apologetic smile. "Mr. Montgomery?" I said, my voice echoing softly through the silent ballroom. My family did not fund my company. They did not provide seed money, and my sister certainly did not write the core business model for my supply chain algorithm, as she claimed just a few minutes ago. The truth is that I funded myself. I funded this entire billion-dollar enterprise by working grueling night shifts as a waitress in a cheap diner. I bought secondhand textbooks and taught myself how to write complex code on a laptop with a broken screen. And I had to do all of those things because my father cut me off financially and threw me out of their house when I was 24 years old. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the minds of everyone listening. I looked briefly at my mother, who was weeping silent tears of absolute social ruin. I was thrown out because I refused to be their trophy daughter. I continued, my voice growing slightly colder. I refused to follow the path they demanded, so they told me I was a disgrace and a failure. They told me I would end up with nothing. And up until this very morning, they genuinely believed I was still that same starving girl they abandoned. The silence in the country club was so profound that you could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpets. The elite guests were completely captivated by the raw and brutal honesty of my revelation. The local politicians and wealthy socialites who had spent years listening to Vivian brag about her perfect family were now looking at her with undisguised contempt. The black elite of Maryland valued success, but they despised public embarrassment and blatant fraud even more. Vivian and Brianna had broken the ultimate social rule by trying to con a billionaire in front of the entire community. There was no coming back from this level of public exposure. Their carefully crafted facade had been burned to the ground, and I had gladly provided the matches. I kept my focus entirely on Richard Montgomery. He was the only person in the room whose reaction truly mattered to the final phase of my plan. I watched as the realization fully settled over his features. Richard was a man who had built his own retail dynasty by recognizing talent and destroying liars. He was a predator in the corporate world, and he possessed a highly tuned instinct for deception. He realized in that exact moment that he had been completely conned by a family of fakes. The charming and sophisticated image my parents had projected to secure this marital alliance was nothing but a hollow shell designed to mask their desperate financial ruin and their profound moral bankruptcy. They had tried to use my success to elevate their own standing, while simultaneously treating me like dirt behind closed doors. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I watched as the various business leaders and country club board members began to physically step away from the center of the room, creating a wide circle of isolation around my mother and sister. They were treating them like they carried a highly contagious disease. In the world of high society, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, and my family was currently experiencing the equivalent of a catastrophic bank run. No one wanted to be associated with the women who had just been exposed as pathological liars and emotional abusers on a public stage. The sheer magnitude of their humiliation was unprecedented in the history of this exclusive venue. I could see the exact moment Brianna's spirit finally broke. She looked down at her hands, which were trembling so violently that her diamond engagement ring caught the light in chaotic flashes. The ring that was supposed to secure her future was now feeling like a heavy shackle. She slowly lifted her head and looked at Spencer, hoping to find a shred of comfort or support in his eyes. She found absolutely nothing. Spencer was looking at her with a mixture of repulsion and deep embarrassment. He had been publicly attached to a woman who just had her toxic personality broadcast for all his wealthy friends to hear. I stood perfectly composed, allowing the reality of my victory to settle deep within my chest. I had not yelled or screamed or lost my temper. I had simply provided the truth and let it do the devastating work for me. I had used their own words and their own greed as the instruments of their destruction. And as Richard Montgomery's furious gaze finally locked onto my father, Reginald standing near the entrance, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My father looked like a man walking into his own funeral. He saw the projected capitalization table on the massive screens. He saw his wife weeping, and his golden daughter shrinking away in shame. And he saw the most powerful retail billionaire in the state glaring at him with a murderous intent. The ultimate reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left for them to hide. The quiet room at the country club seemed to hold its breath as the final echo of my sister's screaming voice faded from the massive sound system. I stood perfectly still in the elevated DJ booth, watching the devastating domino effect of my choices ripple through the elite crowd below. Richard Montgomery was not just an ordinary guest. He was a financial apex predator, and his primary instinct was the absolute preservation of his own power and corporate legacy. He looked at my father Reginald with a profound, chilling disgust that instantly shattered any remaining illusion of patriarchal authority Reginald held. Richard's chest heaved as he took a step forward, his fingers clenching into tight fists at his sides. "You asked me to personally leverage a $10 million bridge loan for your commercial real estate firm just last week," Richard said, his booming voice dripping with absolute revulsion. "You stood in my private study and looked me in the eyes, claiming you possessed massive liquid assets that merely needed temporary stabilization. You are completely broke, aren't you?" Reginald opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw simply trembled without sound. The powerful, wealthy developer who had spent his entire life trying to buy relevance in Prince George's County looked completely shrunken inside his expensive tuxedo jacket. But before he could formulate a pathetic, desperate lie to salvage what was left of his standing, I casually took a sip of my champagne and spoke clearly into the microphone. "He is entirely broke, Richard," I announced, my voice smooth and perfectly amplified across the silent ballroom. In fact, his business did not just encounter a temporary cash flow problem. He defaulted on $45 million in commercial loans last month, and his primary lenders were preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings by tomorrow morning. But they will not be doing that anymore because my company Orasync acquired his entire portfolio of defaulted debt at 8 o'clock this morning. I am his sole creditor now. Richard and I am calling the entire balance due immediately. He is officially facing public and total foreclosure tomorrow morning, before the banks even open their doors. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The surrounding socialites and local politicians gasped, whispering frantically behind their polished hands. My mother Vivian let out a low, horrified moan, her hands dropping from her face as she stared up at me in utter bewilderment. She had sacrificed my basic human dignity and lied to the most powerful billionaires in the state just to secure a lavish lifestyle for her golden child Brianna. And now she was learning that the very daughter she had branded a worthless dropout was the absolute master of their financial survival. Spencer Montgomery looked as though he had been hit by a sudden wave of physical nausea. He looked at the massive projection screens displaying my 100% equity ownership of Orasync, and then turned his cold, furious gaze toward Brianna. Spencer took a slow, deliberate step away from her, physically separating himself from the woman he had been kissing just moments before. "You lied to me," Spencer said, his voice shaking with a deep, elite rage that resonated through the quiet circle. "You sat in my car and told me your family owned half of Prince George's County. You told me your father was expanding his real estate empire into 3 neighboring states. You are a fraud, Brianna. Your entire family is a pathetic circus of broke hustlers trying to buy a seat at our table." Spencer reached down and grabbed Brianna's trembling right hand. With a sharp, aggressive motion, he pulled the multi-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. "The wedding is off," he declared, throwing the ring onto the polished marble floor where it rolled carelessly past her white tulle skirt. "I am not marrying into a family of pathological liars and bankrupt criminals." The house of cards had completely collapsed. Brianna broke down, sobbing violently, her knees buckling under the weight of her sudden public rejection. She dropped to the floor of the country club ballroom, her massive white designer gown flattening into a pathetic pool of lace and silk against the hard marble. She reached out her manicured hands, desperately grasping at the hem of Spencer's tuxedo pants, crying out his name through her gasping breaths. "Spencer, please listen to me," she wailed. Her voice cracked with absolute hysteria. "It was not my fault. My parents told me everything was fine. They told me Nyla was the problem. Please do not do this, Spencer. I love you." When Spencer coldly kicked her hands away and turned his back on her, Brianna turned her tear-stained, frantic face up toward the DJ booth. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and unadulterated hatred. "Nyla, please," she screamed, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Tell them it is a joke. Tell them you are lying. You are ruining my entire life. We are sisters, Nyla. How can you be so heartless to your own blood?" I looked down at my sister, sobbing on the floor from my elevated position. Her question was so intensely ironic it almost made me laugh. She was asking me about heartlessness, after she had spent her entire life watching my mother tear me down for sport. She was asking about family loyalty, after she had left a venomous voicemail calling me a piece of trash just a few hours prior. Vivian realized that Richard's silence meant the absolute end of her social existence. Desperate and completely cornered, my mother lunged toward the platform of the DJ booth, her gold-beaded dress rustling loudly in the suffocating quiet. She pointed a trembling finger up at me, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying rage. "Do not listen to her! Richard!" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing with absolute madness. "She is an ungrateful thief. She has always been a criminal and a parasite. Tell them the truth, Nyla. Tell everyone in this room why you really left our home 5 years ago. Tell them how you broke into my bedroom and stole your own grandmother's priceless heirloom jewelry." Vivian's frantic accusation hung in the heavy air of the ballroom like a toxic cloud of smoke. She was panting heavily, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she pointed her trembling finger up at me. She was playing her final and most desperate card, hoping that the word thief would somehow magically erase the crushing reality of her own bankruptcy and her golden daughter's public humiliation. She was banking on the fact that the wealthy elite in the room, specifically Richard Montgomery, would instantly recoil at the mere suggestion of criminal behavior. She wanted them to believe that I was a sociopath who had orchestrated this entire evening simply to exact revenge for being rightfully disowned. I looked down at my mother and felt a profound and chilling sense of absolute zero. This was the lie. This was the dark and rotting core of our entire family history. This was the fabricated story they had used to justify throwing a teenager out into the street with absolutely nothing. I took a slow breath, letting the cold memories of that night 10 years ago wash over me. I remembered the freezing rain hitting my face as I stood on the porch of their sprawling Maryland estate. I remembered the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser parked in our driveway illuminating the neighborhood with shame. I remembered my mother clutching a velvet jewelry box, crying fake and theatrical tears while telling the officers that she had found her priceless heirloom pieces hidden in my bedroom drawer. And I remembered my father standing beside her, looking at me with dead and unfeeling eyes, telling the police that they did not want to press charges as long as I left the property and never returned. I had been so terrified and so profoundly confused. I had begged them to tell the truth. I had begged them to admit that they had planted the jewelry in my room just hours after I had confronted them about the missing money. But they had simply closed the heavy oak door in my face, leaving me to freeze in the dark. They had used the legal system as a weapon to silence their own child, and they had done it without a single ounce of remorse. Brianna stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, her tear-stained face looking up at our mother with a sudden and pathetic glimmer of hope. She thought this old lie might actually work. She thought Richard Montgomery might turn his disgust away from her and direct it toward me. Spencer looked back and forth between us, his aristocratic features twisted in deep confusion. He was a man who hated scandal, and now he was trapped in the epicenter of the most explosive social disaster of the decade. Richard Montgomery, however, did not look disgusted with me. He looked at Vivian with the cold and calculating stare of a man who recognized a desperate con artist, making her final pathetic play. He knew a drowning woman when he saw one, and he was not about to throw her a life preserver. He crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for my response. I did not raise my voice, and I did not rush to defend myself. Panic is the ultimate admission of guilt, and I had absolutely nothing to be guilty of. I simply raised my left hand and made a very small and subtle gesture toward the heavy oak doors at the grand entrance of the ballroom. The club manager, who was still standing paralyzed near the buffet tables, immediately understood the signal. He notified the security team at the front doors. The heavy wooden panels swung open with a smooth and silent grace. The ambient noise in the ballroom died down even further as every single guest turned their head to see who was entering the room. Stepping through the doors was a tall and impeccably dressed man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit and carrying a very old and very pristine leather-bound ledger in his right hand. This was Marcus, my personal attorney, and one of the most ruthless and terrifying corporate litigators on the East Coast. He walked through the parted sea of wealthy guests with the confident and measured stride of an executioner approaching the block. His shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, creating a steady and rhythmic countdown to my parents' absolute and total destruction. He did not look at the elite socialites or the whispering politicians. He kept his eyes locked firmly on my father, Reginald, who was still standing near the edge of the dance floor, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. Marcus held the ledger with the utmost care, treating it like a sacred artifact of undeniable truth. Marcus reached the center of the room and stopped directly next to Richard Montgomery. He did not say a word. He simply held the old leather-bound ledger up so that the light from the crystal chandeliers caught the worn edges of the binding. My mother, Vivian, let out a sharp and strangled gasp that sounded like she was physically choking on her own breath. Her eyes locked onto the ledger, and the remaining color in her face completely vanished. She took a stumbling step backward, bumping heavily into Brianna, who was still sitting in a pathetic heap of white tulle on the floor. Reginald let out a low and guttural groan, running his hands over his face in pure defeat. His shoulders slumped forward as the reality of the object in front of him shattered his mind. They both recognized the ledger immediately. It was the exact same book they thought they had successfully destroyed in a fire 10 years ago. I brought the wireless microphone back up to my lips. My voice resonated through the massive speakers, perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. I did not steal anything, Vivian, I announced, ensuring that every single syllable reached the furthest corners of the country club. I want everyone in this room to look very closely at the book my attorney is holding. When I was 19 years old, I was cleaning out the attic in our family home, and I found that exact leather-bound ledger hidden inside a sealed box. I opened it because I was curious. What I found inside was not family history or old photographs. What I found was a meticulously detailed record of absolute and undeniable financial fraud committed by the very people who were supposed to protect me. I paused, letting the sheer horror of the statement absorb into the minds of the audience. The local politicians, who had previously associated with my father, began to physically edge closer to the exits, not wanting to be caught anywhere near a financial scandal of this magnitude. The ledger proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Reginald and Vivian had forged my signature on multiple legal documents. I continued, my voice echoing with cold and calculated precision. They forged my signature to gain illegal access to a $2 million trust fund. That money was left explicitly and solely for me by my late grandmother to ensure that my education and my future would be fully covered. My grandmother was the only person in this family who truly believed in my potential, and they desecrated her dying wishes. Reginald was facing bankruptcy for the first time, and he needed massive liquid capital to save his failing commercial real estate firm. So they drained my grandmother's trust fund. They took every single penny of my $2 million and they funneled it directly into his sinking company. The collective gasp from the 300 elite guests was deafening. In the high society of the black elite, stealing from your own child and disrespecting the dying wishes of an elder was the ultimate and most unforgivable sin. It was a violation of every social and moral code they pretended to uphold. People began muttering in absolute horror, shaking their heads, and looking at my parents with pure and unadulterated disgust. Brianna looked up at my mother, her eyes wide and panicked. She had always benefited from my parents' wealth, and she had gladly accepted the praise for being the golden child. But she had never known the dark and criminal origins of the money that paid for her luxury cars, and her designer clothes, and her expensive medical school tuition. She was realizing that her entire privileged existence was a massive fraud, funded entirely by the money they had stolen from my future. Her success was built on the ashes of my stolen inheritance. I took a slow step down the stairs of the DJ booth, keeping my eyes locked on my trembling parents. When I discovered the ledger and realized what they had done, I confronted them. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low and intimate register. I was terrified and betrayed, but I told them I was going to the police to report the embezzlement. I told them they had to put the money back. But instead of apologizing or trying to make things right, they decided to protect their fragile social standing by destroying their own daughter. While I was at school the next day, they staged a burglary in our own home. They took my mother's most expensive heirloom jewelry, and they hid it in my bedroom drawer. When I came home, they had already called the police to wait for me. They told me that if I breathed a single word about the $2 million trust fund, they would press formal charges and have me arrested for grand larceny. They blackmailed a 19-year-old girl with a fabricated prison sentence just to cover up their own massive financial crimes. Vivian collapsed completely onto the marble floor right next to Brianna. Her legs completely gave out under the crushing weight of her total public exposure. She covered her face with her trembling hands, sobbing loudly and pathetically into the quiet room. The women she had tried to impress all evening were now staring down at her with absolute revulsion. Reginald was leaning heavily against a cocktail table, struggling to pull air into his lungs. He looked like he was having a physical medical emergency, but nobody in the room moved a single inch to help him. Richard Montgomery was staring at my father with a look of such profound contempt that it could have frozen water solid. The billionaire patriarch had built his empire on ruthless business tactics, but even he possessed a baseline code of ethics that firmly drew the line at extorting and framing a teenage child. The Montgomery family was now looking at my biological relatives, not just as broke imposters, but as genuine and malicious predators who belonged behind bars. My attorney Marcus did not offer them a single second to recover from the devastating shockwave of my public revelation. He walked with slow and deliberate steps directly toward my father. The crowd parted for him in absolute silence, watching the final and most destructive act of my revenge unfold. Marcus reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick and heavy stack of folded legal papers. The papers were crisp and white, and they carried the absolute uncompromising authority of the legal system my parents had once weaponized against me so long ago. Reginald looked up at the lawyer, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his chest heaving with panicked and erratic breaths. He knew exactly what those papers meant, but his mind was too fractured to accept the reality of his impending destruction. Marcus stopped inches away from the broken man and held the thick stack of documents out toward my trembling father, sealing the permanent end of their deceptive and fraudulent lives. Marcus did not blink as he thrust the thick stack of legal documents directly into Reginald's chest, forcing my father to take them or let them fall to the floor. Reginald grabbed the papers with shaking hands, his eyes darting frantically across the bold black text on the front page. "You are officially being served," Reginald Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold and detached authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. "These are formal notices for both civil and criminal lawsuits filed in the state of Maryland. You and your wife Vivian are being charged with multiple counts of financial fraud, felony embezzlement, and the forgery of legal documents regarding the $2 million trust fund belonging to my client. We have already submitted the original ledger to the district attorney along with the digital paper trail showing exactly how you moved those stolen funds into your failing real estate business. The state is freezing all of your remaining personal accounts as we speak to prevent any further flight of capital. Reginald's knees finally gave out completely. He collapsed heavily into a plush velvet chair sitting near the edge of the dance floor, clutching his chest as if he were having a massive coronary event. He gasped for air, looking down at the legal summons that officially marked the end of his freedom. Vivian began to hyperventilate. The perfectly curated social image she had spent 30 years building was now obliterated in front of the exact people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. The elite socialites of Prince George County were looking at her not just as a bankrupt fraud, but as a criminal who belonged in a federal penitentiary. She backed away from Marcus, shaking her head back and forth as if denying the reality of the moment would somehow make the lawyers disappear. She looked around the grand ballroom, searching desperately for a single friendly face, a single ally who might step forward and defend her. She found absolutely nothing. The wealthy guests turned their backs on her, physically shielding themselves from the toxic fallout of her crimes. Vivian sank to the floor, her elaborate gold dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She clawed at her own hair, ruining her pristine updo as she sobbed uncontrollably into the suffocating silence of the room. She was experiencing a complete and total social death, and it was agonizing to witness. Brianna, who was still sitting in a pathetic heap of white bridal tulle, suddenly snapped. The realization that she was completely abandoned by her wealthy fiancé and that her parents were going to prison broke whatever fragile sanity she had left. She scrambled to her feet and turned her absolute fury entirely onto her own mother and father. "You ruined my life!" Brianna screamed at them, her voice tearing through her throat in a violent and ugly shriek. "You told me the money was legally ours. You told me she could never prove it." Brianna pointed a shaking finger at Vivian, whose face was buried in her hands. "You promised me that dropping out of medical school broke her trust fund conditions. You lied to me. You said you burned that stupid ledger 10 years ago. Why did you not burn it? You stupid, arrogant fools! You just cost me my marriage to a billionaire." The family instantly turned on each other like starved rats trapped in a sinking cage. Reginald found his voice just long enough to scream back at his golden child, telling Brianna that her expensive medical school tuition and her luxury cars were paid for with that stolen money, and she was just as guilty as they were. They stood in the middle of the opulent country club, screaming and blaming one another, tearing each other to pieces in front of 300 horrified guests. It was a disgusting and pathetic display of greed and cowardice. I turned my attention away from the screaming wreckage of my biological relatives and looked at Richard Montgomery. The silver-haired retail titan had watched the entire execution with a stoic and calculating expression. He had seen my absolute ruthlessness, and he respected it deeply. He knew that a woman who could dismantle her own corrupt bloodline with such chilling efficiency was exactly the kind of apex predator he wanted managing his supply chain logistics. Richard stepped forward and offered me a slow and deeply respectful nod. "Mrs. Nyla," he said, his booming voice dropping to a tone of genuine professional reverence. "I must say, I have never witnessed a more thorough or impressive restructuring of bad debt in my entire life. My executive office will call your assistant first thing on Monday morning. I look forward to doing business with someone of your exceptional caliber." I returned his nod, acknowledging the shift in power. "I look forward to our meeting, Richard," I replied smoothly. Richard turned and gestured for his son to follow him. Spencer did not even look back at Brianna. He simply adjusted his velvet tuxedo jacket and walked out of the grand ballroom, trailing behind his powerful father and leaving his former fiancée wailing hysterically on the marble floor. The Montgomery family exited the building entirely, taking the last remaining shred of my family's social standing with them. The devastation was absolute, but the night was not over. Vivian saw the billionaires leave and realized that her only remaining lifeline in the entire world was the daughter she had thrown into the freezing rain a decade ago. She crawled across the polished floor on her hands and knees, her gold dress dragging heavily behind her. She reached me and grabbed the hem of my emerald silk gown, burying her tear-stained face against my legs. "Neela, my baby, please," Vivian begged, her voice cracking with raw and pathetic desperation. "We are your parents. We are your blood. You have $1 billion, Nyla. You can make all of these lawsuits go away. Please have mercy on us." Vivian kept clutching the hem of my emerald gown, sobbing and begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. Her tears stained the expensive silk, but I did not step away immediately. I stood there and looked down at the woman who had brought me into this world, only to treat me like a disease she needed to cure. The entire ballroom was still watching us, but the silence was no longer filled with shock. It was filled with absolute finality. Reginald was still gasping for air in his chair, and Brianna was still weeping on the marble floor, mourning the loss of her billionaire fiancé and her stolen wealth. They were entirely broken, and they had built the very trap that crushed them. I looked down at my mother, and I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or offer her the satisfaction of my anger. My voice was perfectly calm, and it carried the heavy weight of a decade of healing. I told Vivian that she had texted me just yesterday afternoon. I reminded her that she had specifically told me not to come to this engagement party because the guest list was completely final. I looked into her panicked and tear-streaked face, and I delivered my final verdict. I told her that today the guest list for the rest of my entire life was officially final, and absolutely none of them were on it. Vivian's hands fell away from my dress as the reality of my words paralyzed her completely. She finally understood that there was no negotiation and no forgiveness to be bought. I turned my back on my biological family. I did not look back at my mother kneeling on the floor, or my father gripping his chest, or my sister crying over a lost diamond ring. I simply walked toward the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, leaving them to face the wealthy crowd they had tried so desperately to impress. The elite socialites and local politicians parted for me once again, offering me a wide and respectful path out of the wreckage. I walked out of the country club and stepped into the crisp night air of the Maryland suburbs. The freezing winter wind hit my face, but it did not feel cold. It felt incredibly clean and pure. The valet had already brought my black Maybach to the front of the sweeping stone staircase. My driver opened the rear door for me with a polite nod. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat and told him to take me home. As the car pulled through the wrought iron gates and merged onto the quiet highway, I leaned my head against the tinted window. I closed my eyes and let out a long and steady breath. The heavy chains of seeking their approval and enduring their toxic abuse were permanently shattered. I was finally completely and entirely free. 3 months passed since the night I dropped the digital guillotine on their house of cards. The consequences of their actions unspooled with a ruthless and mechanical efficiency. Reginald's commercial real estate firm completely collapsed under the weight of his defaulted loans. Orasync officially absorbed every single one of his remaining assets, stripping him of his entire corporate identity. The state of Maryland did not show any leniency toward their financial crimes. My legal team handed over the original leather-bound ledger and the digital paper trail proving the theft of my grandmother's $2 million trust fund. Reginald and Vivian were formally indicted, and they were currently facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years in federal prison for felony embezzlement and fraud. They had to sell their sprawling estate and every piece of designer clothing just to afford their defense attorneys. Their elite social standing in Prince George County was entirely eradicated. They were completely blacklisted from every country club and charity board they had once dominated. Their former wealthy friends refused to even acknowledge their existence, treating them like total pariahs. Brianna's fate was equally poetic and devastating. The loss of the Montgomery marital alliance and the public exposure of her toxic personality destroyed her reputation in the elite medical community. Without my stolen inheritance to fund her lavish lifestyle, she was forced to abandon her private dermatology clinic aspirations. She was currently working a grueling and basic clinical shift at a lower-tier hospital on the other side of the state. The wealthy socialites she had once bullied and belittled now completely ignored her. She lived in a small rented apartment entirely stripped of the luxury and status she believed she was inherently entitled to. They had all built their lives on an illusion of superiority, and when that illusion was shattered, they had absolutely nothing left to stand on. As for my own life, the trajectory only continued upward into the stratosphere. I was currently sitting in the massive sunlit boardroom of the Orasync Executive Tower. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the world I had conquered on my own terms. I was not alone in this magnificent space. I was surrounded by my senior executive team and my brilliant lead developers and my loyal legal advisors. This diverse and brilliant group of people represented my chosen family. They were the people who had stood by me when I was building code in a tiny apartment, and they were the people who celebrated my victories without an ounce of jealousy. They respected my mind and my character, not just my bank accounts. I sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, holding a solid gold fountain pen. Sitting directly across from me was Richard Montgomery, the retail billionaire who had recognized my power on the night of the engagement party. He was smiling with genuine professional admiration as he watched me sign the final page of our massive corporate contract. The partnership with the Montgomery Empire solidified Orasync as an untouchable force in the global market. I handed the signed contract back to Richard, and the entire boardroom erupted into a round of warm and genuine applause. I looked around at the smiling faces of my chosen family, and I felt a profound and overwhelming sense of pure joy. I had lost my biological relatives, but I had gained an entire universe of authentic and supportive connections. I stood up and walked over to the glass wall, looking down at the sprawling city below. The sunlight caught the diamond necklace resting against my collarbone, reflecting a brilliant and blinding light. My mother had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a disappointment who would amount to nothing. She had tried to bury me in the dark to ensure that her golden child could shine. But she had completely failed to realize that some seeds are planted in the dark, specifically so they can grow deep roots before they rise toward the sun. I was a college dropout who had been thrown away by her own bloodline. And now, I was an untouchable billionaire standing at the absolute pinnacle of my industry. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled at my reflection in the glass. The revenge was absolute, and the freedom was incredibly deeply sweet. True worth is never defined by toxic family members who only value you when you acquire money and power. Real success comes from trusting your own vision and building an empire in complete silence. You do not owe loyalty to people who treated you like a burden when you were struggling to survive. Walking away from an abusive bloodline is not a failure, but rather the ultimate and most absolute victory. The best revenge is simply becoming completely untouchable and letting their own selfish greed destroy them from the inside out, while you finally claim your absolute freedom and peace. If you have ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your experience in the comments below and hit the subscribe button.